Hello, and welcome to Voters on the Move, hosted by California Humanities as part of our initiative, California on the Ballot. My name is Kirsten Vega. I organize this series, and I am delighted to be joined today by our guests, Dr. Sarah Sadhwani and Carlos Martín. We're so glad you can be here with us today for this program. I'd like to say a few words about the series, and then I'll give the floor to Sarah and Carlos, who will be in conversation tonight. Firstly, if you're not familiar with California Humanities, we are an independent nonprofit organization and a partner of the National Endowment for the Humanities, who has generously supported today's program through their initiative, A More Perfect Union. We have been operating since 1975 as producers, funders, and supporters of the humanities in California. We've awarded over $38 million in grants across the state in every congressional district. So in that spirit, we started a program called California on the Ballot, which seeks to unpack the political experiment that is the American Republic in the corner of California, which can sometimes be its most visible laboratory. In today's program, we are going to continue in our theme for season 2, which is voters' barriers to voting. We'll talk tonight about the theme Voters on the Move. What factors are driving California's population to change demographically and in other senses, and what prompting changes will we see in the voter body of California? We'll hear from Sarah and Carlos. We'd also love to hear from you during this session. So if you have a question, please do put it in the panel chat and Q&A for Sarah and Carlos to address about 5:15. Now to introduce Sarah and Carlos. Dr. Sarah Sadhwani is an assistant professor of politics at Pomona College, and this fall she'll be a visiting scholar at Stanford University's Bill Lane Center for the American West. Sarah specializes in Asian American and Latino voting behavior, elections, interest groups, and representation. She has been published widely in academic journals, and her analysis of political landscapes has been featured in places like the New York Times, the Washington Post, and NPR. She'll tell us more about this tonight, but she served in 2021 on the Citizens Redistricting Commission for the state of California, which successfully redrew the boundary lines for Congress, the state legislature, and the State Board of Equalization. With her in conversation is Carlos Martín, who is a David M. Rubenstein Fellow at Brookings and the director of the Remodeling Futures Program at Harvard University's Joint Center for Housing Studies. Carlos is a trained architect and a construction engineer who connects the bricks and mortar of housing to social outcomes. He has led for 20 years evaluation, research, and policy analysis for federal, state, and civic center entities. His areas of expertise include green housing, disaster mitigation, which he'll talk about tonight, and the construction workforce. So with that, over to you and Carlos, Sarah. Thanks so much.
This has been an ongoing trend, but what was unique is that we're seeing a specific migration of Black and Latino communities moving into these areas. Similarly, in Northern California, we saw growth in San Joaquin County and even in the Central Valley. And that became an important component when we thought about redistricting the state. We also saw growth in many mid-sized cities, places like Irvine in Orange County and Santa Clarita in Los Angeles County, but north of the city. So those became important pieces, particularly from a redistricting standpoint as well, and has a lot of significant political consequences also. I also want to note, just before we move on to talk about why people are moving, just some of the limitations of the last census. And as we all know and have survived, thankfully, this census was very unique because it occurred during a pandemic. Census Day is April 1st, 2020, or April 1st of any year with a zero at the end of it. But this time around for this census, of course, the state had already shut down closer to March 12th, and different counties having slightly different shutdown dates. But but things were already shut down. As a college professor, for us, that meant students were going home, which meant they weren't going to be counted on their college campuses, but probably back in their homes with their families, which is a key difference, particularly when you have college towns that tend to be highly populated with college students. It also meant that hard to reach communities were even harder to reach. Many communities who are a little bit more insular, right? Immigrant communities, for example, rural communities, people that were staying at home and not engaging in community activities it was more difficult to find them, right? Census workers are prepared to go out to different carnivals and fairs and community events. But people, of course, because of the pandemic, were not gathering. So it became even more difficult to go out and reach people. In addition, there was a politics that was occurring at that time. The former administration was really waging war on the census, attempting to have undocumented immigrants identified within the census. So early on in the process, there was movement to include on the census a citizenship question. Here in California, especially working within immigrant communities, we know that including questions like that will have a chilling effect on many immigrant communities who we want to have fill out the census. They were, the administration was not successful in adding that citizenship question. Even the Supreme Court had really said, look, this is not about citizenship. This is about getting an accurate count of all people residing within the boundaries of the United States. But later, even after the census was conducted, there was continued attempts to try and identify, to have the Census Bureau kind of go back and try and figure out and identify who was undocumented and who wasn't. So we can anticipate those kinds of changes or attempted changes to the census policies could potentially give people pause in wanting to respond to the census and to fill out those census forms. In addition, when we think about the census politics of that time period, what we saw in most realms of public life were extensions to deadlines. We saw the tax deadline extended, for example, right? Mortgage payments and were being forgiven or extended. There were emergency loans being made available. There was a real acknowledgement that because of the shutdown, things had to change a little bit. Early on, there was a sense that we should expand the time period of the census. But as things progressed, the administration actually pushed to move up the census timeline for completing the census. It essentially creating a situation in which states wanted to spend more time going out into communities and collecting this information and ultimately not being able to. Here in California, the state invested heavily in the California Complete Count, relying on different community-based organizations to serve as trusted messengers and really promote participation in the census count. And I think the state of California was wise to do so. Ultimately, while we did, of course, lose one congressional seat here in the state of California, we certainly could have lost two. Many people were projecting that was a possibility with low participation rates in the census. But really, given the incredible work of the Complete Count office through the state of California, we were able to go out and reach folks in rural communities, in communities that didn't necessarily have access to the internet, in immigrant communities where there's a fear of government based on where they've come from in their different homelands and their relationship with government in their homelands potentially. So I think that there was an incredible amount of effort here in California put into ensuring as complete of a count as possible. And yet we also have to recognize that there was an undercount that occurred. With that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Carlos, to talk a little bit about why these changes happen and to share more about his research. Carlos?
Hi. Thanks, Dr. Sadhwani. And I should note that I, unlike Dr. Sadhwani, am not a political scientist, nor am I a demographer. So when I'm talking about housing movements, I'm talking about what I know from two hats. And one is being a houser. And by houser, I mean somebody who studies the housing stock throughout the whole country. And I do that through my lens at Harvard. And being somebody who studies climate change. And climate change, we've obviously heard over the last maybe 5 years, a lot of conversations about climate migrants and climate migration being a likely cause for a lot of displacement and movement. So let me contextualize this a bit more. So when we talk about movement in California, and as you can see, I'm not a political scientist, I'm not a demographer, but I am a Californian. So, and every Californian has an opinion. So I'm currently not in California, but what you see is the view from my parents' home in El Cerrito, California, in Contra Costa County. So the causes of Californians moving are ones that we've seen throughout this country and quite frankly throughout this planet. Family reasons, for job changes, and number 3, for housing and other related costs that are available to households. And I would emphasize the housing part of it. So we saw just in 1 year, for example, Californians saying that from 2020, 36% of Californians saying they would seriously leave the state. They were considering seriously leaving the state because of their housing costs, to 46%. Am I getting those numbers right? 37% to 46%. So almost half of Californians have seriously considered leaving the state because of housing costs. And so it doesn't surprise you that a lot of people actually are moving the state. Just to put some numbers around the changes that Sarah was mentioning, California, there are about 20 states in the union that have been going through some serious population decline. Just in from 2020 to 2021, we know that about 20 states have continued that process just in this past year. Of those, only 3 states have lost over 50,000 people or more. And that's up to 367,000, which is California being the number 1. Illinois and New York State are the other the other 2 states in this condition. So obviously these are states with a lot of population. So a little movement means a lot for these states, but that suggests a lot about sort of the population changes that we're expecting to see. So number 1, like I said, housing and housing costs are expected to continue growing up. They're softening now throughout the whole country, but in places like California, we've seen this result in inaffordability of housing. In not one state, not one county in California, from San Diego to Sonoma, can you afford a home if you make less than $200,000 a year. So only, what is that, Humboldt, Del Norte, and Mendocino counties can you afford, with slightly less than $200,000 a year annual household income, can you afford a house. So that suggests a lot, not just about the state of California being an economic powerhouse and being a job driver. So jobs aren't the people leave California unless their job has moved. California attracts people because of jobs. In contrast, Californians leave to other states because of the housing costs as being one of the primary reasons. So I should note, though, that doesn't mean that just Californians leave the state. They also move elsewhere. So if almost every county except the 3 in very northern California have extreme housing costs, people move inland. So these are the patterns that Sarah was talking about, people moving into the Inland Empire, into San Joaquin Valley, into the Sacramento Valley. So a clear movement, a pattern of people. That means that people are moving or commuting longer to get to their homes. So we're seeing a pattern of California sprawl that's happened over the last 4 decades. So, but I do want to talk a little bit more about this issue about climate migration. So we have heard a lot of anecdotal evidence of people in California concerned about their sea level, their exposure to potential flooding. It's certainly less in California than it is in other parts of the country, like the Gulf South, and certainly places like Florida and Louisiana in particular. But California is certainly much more exposed to wildfires. But what happens? So difference here is that the wildfires are occurring inland, are occurring in places that people may move to within the state of California. So there are a couple of very famous examples of this kind of movement, and the movement is temporal. There are big swaths of people who move during a major incident like a wildfire or a flood or significant sea level event, or in California's case, non-climate related events like seismic activities, right? There's evacuation, people's homes are destroyed, they need to live somewhere else temporarily. Um, uh, so the extent to which that temporality becomes a permanence in which people have chosen to move because, and in many cases, continue moving until they find the job, an affordable home, a place where their kids can go to school, a place where they could settle their families, or a place where they feel comfortable culturally, is it sort of a long-term process. What that happens, so again, I'm not a political scientist, but we know that that has clear changes to the political demography, the political makeup, the partisanship of places as people move. There are two cases that I want to talk about. One is one that I have studied, and that was Puerto Ricans who left after Hurricane Maria and left Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria in 2017 and moved particularly to Central Florida, to Orange and Osceola counties. In that case, it was a very unique one. There was a governor who was also running shortly thereafter for Senate, US Senate, from senator from Florida, who invested a significant amount of resources in making sure that the Puerto Rican evacuees were welcome, were given temporary housing, temporary health services, food services, et cetera, in coordination with Orange County and with the city of Orlando. So as Puerto Ricans got off the planes in Orlando airport, at the airport, there were hallways full of city, county, and state service providers, public agents providing resources to the communities, providing additional references to charitable organizations, et cetera. That was a very unique case, right? One can speculate that part of the reason that that occurred was because there was Puerto Ricans could vote, right? Puerto Ricans are US citizens, so they could vote in Florida. They could vote immediately, and if they were registered in Florida for upcoming elections. So there was this idea that we need to make these people a similar party, knowing that traditionally Puerto Ricans who have emigrated to the United States were Democrats. There was an ideal to make them Republican. So let's talk about the other case. That did not occur, P.S., because those people who evacuated and lived in Orlando had other things to think about in their long-term transition than voting in the short term. So the other case I'd like to talk about is California. It's a case of the Camp Fire. So the Paradise residents who moved over to Chico. And what happened in Chico? Chico had ostensibly been a sort of solid blue dot in a red sea. Chico was a college town. Again, giving a hat to Sarah's comment about these kinds of occurrences in the inland parts of California. But with the advent of residents leaving from Paradise, because there was no more Paradise to live in, and living in all kinds of conditions in Chico. This included homeless encampments, living in their vehicles in Walmart parking lots, et cetera. There was a sea change that occurred in Chico. And that one, I think, was worthy of exploration. I think most Californians know this story now at this point, in which housing costs have skyrocketed in Chico, causing a lot of the Paradise migrants, as well as permanent low-income residents who pre-existed in Chico, having severe housing hardships. But it also caused a backlash, political backlash, and that involved not just the very clear civic organization organizing that led to the eventual impeachment, if that's the word that's used in Chico city governance, of the mayor and city council members, but also a clear sense that this other that was coming into their territory. Granted, keep in mind, this other was just from Paradise, California, literally down the road from Chico, were referred to as being a burden on society by the leading Chico civic group that created this momentum behind it. So there was a real backlash and a real perception that this movement was not only going to cause temporary financial challenges for the community in which these people moved to, but also would be a cultural and a political sea change. So I think that's the question that I think we could start embarking on with Sarah and conversation with. We have a pretty tight group that's participating here, so I would invite you all to put questions, if that's okay with the conference organizers, into the chat or in the Q&A, the formal Q&A. But I think it'd be really interesting to hear your perceptions about how this is occurring. I should have noted before I got into my climate migrant stories that in California, we still don't have a lot of evidence that people are moving either out of the state or to other parts of the state because of their the perceptions of their climate exposures. Part of the reason I believe that's the case is that people would be moving to other places that are just as exposed. There's no place in the United States or on planet Earth that will not experience some exposure to climate change's effects. So let's be very clear about that. So I think when people talk about people moving from one place to another, there's some legitimacy, but usually it's because there's a crisis event that causes people to move, not because they want to move to a place that's not exposed. It's to move because where they are is no longer viable or occupiable or habitable. So, all right.
Thank you. And then I'll just add a few more words just about redistricting itself. And I actually have a few slides if I can share my screen. Let's see. And I certainly won't go through all of these slides. Let's see if that works. Are you all seeing that? The PowerPoint? Yeah, okay, great. So, as was mentioned in the beginning, I had the opportunity to serve on the California Citizens Redistricting Commission. And of course, all of these changes in California's demographics have very real political consequences. And of course, where we see that in particular is in redistricting, which is a process that not everyone is always paying attention to, but I will argue you should, because it has significant consequences to our elections, to the structure of our elections, and to the kind of representation that people and communities are receiving. So of course, California, well, actually, first, let me back up and just introduce you to your 14 commissioners. The California Citizens Redistricting Commission, of course, was adopted many years ago, back in 2008, through a ballot proposition. It is an independent commission, which means we hold the power to draw the lines, as the little sign behind me says. We draw the lines, not the legislature, not sitting elected officials who have, of course, a self-interest to stay in office and to have their party stay in office. We're made up of 5 Democrats, 5 Republicans, and 4 independents. And there's some photos of all of your 14 commissioners here. We were a very diverse group spanning in age from our 30s to our late 60s. We had folks from Northern California, Southern California, the Central Valley, all different professions, backgrounds, races, religions, abilities, sexual orientations. So really a very diverse group, all in all, and hopefully as representative as possible of the state of California. And we engage in this decennial process once every 10 years in redistricting following the census, largely because the Supreme Court has said that we need to have because we operate single member districts, these districts in which we vote in, those districts need to be of equal population. And that's the #1 criteria that the commission is mandated by law to use. And of course, over the course of 10 years, as Carlos just explained, communities change, they shift for a host of reasons. It could be because of a wildfire in Paradise. It could be because of the cost of living, right, in a metropolitan area. It could be for a host of other reasons. People also are born, they pass away, they move, communities grow, they shrink in some areas. And so districts become either underpopulated or overpopulated. And so once every 10 years, we engage in this process. in the state of California, given our population, that means that in a congressional district, this is the exact number of people that we need to have in a congressional district, 760,066 people. And when it comes to congressional districts, because those are federal districts, we were operating on a margin of literally one person. So you won't see a district in the state of California with 761,000, for example. We're very close to 760 and 66 people. In the state legislative seats, there's greater flexibility there, but on those federal seats, we're really getting down there. So when people talk about things like gerrymandering and look at the shape of a district and say, oh, it must be gerrymandered, use some additional tests, right? Because in some instances, even here in California, we had districts that were drawn and they might look oddly shaped to you because we had the basic structure of it. But to get down to that exact number, we would sometimes have to go down to the census block level and be changing out, minus 50 here and plus 43 over there, right? Just to get to exactly that number with a small deviation. One of the other key components of redistricting is that we're operating with very specific criteria. So as I mentioned, equal population is our #1 criteria. And #2 is adherence to the Voting Rights Act. This is, of course, federal legislation coming out of the era of Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights era in the 1960s. But this legislation continues to be an important tool to ensuring that those communities who have historically been shut out of the voting process, who have faced discrimination at the ballot box historically, have an opportunity for meaningful representation. And we can certainly, I'm happy to answer more questions about the Voting Rights Act. There's a lot of different considerations and analyses that went into creating our Voting Rights Act districts. We have a host of other criteria. I'll draw your attention just in terms of time's sake to the fourth one, which is communities of interest. And this says communities of interest, but it also the fourth criteria talks about respecting city and county borders. This has become a really contentious part of our work on the commission. We spent the bulk of our year and a half on the commission before we finalized the maps, collecting testimony from communities on the ground. Though it was COVID, we held meetings virtually for different regions of the state, collecting crucial information about where communities lie and what communities want to be kept together. So we heard things, for example, in Southern California, like about the city of Long Beach and how they wanted to be kept together and have one port in a district, not both Long Beach and the city of Los Angeles, San Pedro port, but to have them be separated. That weighed heavily in some of our decision making. Though we weren't able to keep the city of Long Beach completely whole, we were able to keep the ports separate in 2 different districts. We heard from the Vietnamese American community in Orange County saying that they wanted to be kept together, that they had been split up 10 years ago in the redistricting process, and they wanted to ensure that their communities that lay over the course of 3 different cities would be kept together. So it's really a host of different kinds of testimony that we were receiving. And amongst the 14 of us, weighing that testimony and doing what we could to honor as many of those requests as possible. And when we couldn't honor them in one map, perhaps making trade-offs, right? Making sure that the community was kept together in the state assembly map if we couldn't keep them together in the congressional map, or vice versa. So there were a host of things that kind of go into the process of creating fair and fair representation for Californians. Across the board, we feel like we did a good job from the get-go getting started, and we're a number of citizens. We're 14 citizens. We haven't done this before. There was a lot of learning that we had to go into the process. But we feel really, really confident about the product that we were able to deliver to the people of California. We saw some significant changes in the maps. Of course, we had 1 fewer congressional district, so we knew going into it, given the changes in the census, that this was going to be a contentious process, and we knew that there was going to be 1 sitting member of Congress that's not going to go back. That being said, we don't think about sitting members of Congress at all. We don't think about incumbents. We don't look at competitiveness of the districts necessarily. We certainly are not looking at any sort of political data when we're building these districts. We also don't contemplate where incumbents live. So you may have seen some of the headlines that, particularly in the state legislature, it turned out, we didn't know at the time, it's not something we were looking at, but a lot of legislators ended up moving to new cities so that they could run for office in a district that was maybe somewhat similar to where they had been, but they had ultimately not been put in the same region where they had previously served. It also, I think, ended up meaning that many legislators moved on to different careers or didn't run for office again. In addition, we saw, in terms of our Voting Rights Act analysis, and given the growth of the Latino community within the state of California, we saw an increase in our Latino majority minority districts. So there were a number of increases in those districts, both in terms of those that we clearly identified as VRA districts, as well as those that were also majority minority districts. And we can talk about that difference if that's of interest. Our congressional districts, for example, we increased the number of Latino majority minority districts by 6, now up to 16 districts. So a number of things were different in the kinds of configurations, and happy to talk if you have questions about any of the particular areas. We received nearly 40,000 pieces of testimony from communities on the ground. We were using all sorts of online tools, which I'm showing here, where community members could submit to the commission their ideas for how districts should be drawn, or tell us and map out where they saw their community lie. For example, in Yolo and Mono counties in the Sierra Nevadas, we heard loud and clear from them that they have been getting their representation. They've been linked. They're small counties in terms of population, but they've been linked to the Central Valley for a very long time. And they didn't want to continue to be linked to the Central Valley because that meant representation had to go over, and an elected official had to go over the mountains to actually access them. So a part of our new districts, there's these long districts along the Nevada border. That's by design. It was at the request of communities who said, hey, we're all mountain communities with strong tourism. And so you now see a district that spans the Sierra Nevadas all the way up to Lake Tahoe, bringing those communities together. So there's a lot more information available about the maps and about our process. And I'm happy to share additional information, particularly if there's questions about any area of the state that folks might be interested in. It was an incredible process, but really kind of points to the importance of accurately capturing where people lie, the demographics that we have today. And ultimately, I mean, I think one of the key pieces, kind of just to wrap all of this together, perhaps, is that the census data, despite some of the potential flaws that exist in the census data, particularly given that it was collected during COVID, excuse me, really, even despite some of those flaws, that is the database that we use, right? So even though it may not be perfect, it is also nevertheless what we must use and rely upon. So we can anticipate that had we had an even more complete count, that there might have been some differences or some changes in how those maps were drawn. So I'll stop there and happy to take questions, or if Carlos, if you have more that you wanted to add, and just in terms of the political consequences of these demographic changes, I'm happy to turn it over to you.
Sure. I think there's a question coming in, but I am intrigued by this idea of sort of the political implications, not just of the commission, but of the overall demographic trends with regard to race and income, and how those are affected by the local economies of the places that people are going to. I mean, certainly this movement of people of color from traditional coastal cities in California, of the large cities, the large metropolitan areas that have been international and domestic migrant sort of pools, magnets for such a long time, and the movement inland. I mean, if you could talk a little bit about this transition that we saw in places like Orange County, these famous cases of people, of the browning of Orange County and the browning of sort of the central, I mean, the Central Valley has always been brown, but like the browning of the mountain California would be interesting.
Yeah. So Orange County was one of those really fascinating places. And as a political scientist and someone who specifically studies Asian and Latino voting behavior, I had already been doing a lot of work and analysis in that region, right? Even before redistricting, before the census, we saw a significant political shifting happening in Orange County, where there were 3 congressional districts that were flip-flopping back and forth between Democrats and Republicans over the last couple of years. So it was a really interesting place. Of course, from a redistricting standpoint, we weren't thinking about partisan makeup or anything like that. Instead, we were looking at testimony that we received, and we received a lot. And it was fascinating stuff. So a part of the demographic changes, certainly, in Orange County, we now have Latino majority minority district, a single Latino majority minority district right in the heart of the county in the Santa Ana region. Those were districts that previously would have been considered Latino influence districts, meaning there was a large proportion of Latinos who were of a citizen voting age. But they didn't cross that threshold of majority minority of crossing over 50%. They do now, and from all of the analysis that we did of voting behavior in that area, we saw that it was a requirement under the Voting Rights Act to draw districts in that way. So that was kind of an anchor. Those VRA districts, because those are legally mandated, that served as an anchor in Orange County. And now that there's a legal requirement to draw a district generally in a certain way, right in the center of the county, it meant then that there was a lot of shifting around that district that we had to do. In addition, just north of there in LA County, I don't have the number in front of me, but there is a significant number of VRA districts as well. In the assembly, as you go up into Orange County, there's an Asian American VRA district in the assembly maps. So Southern California became a very difficult place to map, because we had all of these legal requirements that we were thinking about. In Orange County, so we have this VRA district, and then around it, we were receiving a lot of testimony from coastal communities, right? When we think about environment, we were hit hard by communities that said, look, we have a lot of environmental concerns. At the time, there had been an oil spill just off of Huntington Beach, and the beach was closed for some time. We had the Surf Riders Foundation calling and saying, hey, we have a lot of environmental concerns about the stewardship of the ocean and of the beaches. So a real push to keep a district that was coastal in nature. As I mentioned, the Vietnamese community in Garden Grove, Westminster, Fountain Valley really wanted to be kept together. They had been separated in the congressional districts previously. And so we heard the Vietnamese community was very well organized, calling in every single day to ensure that their voice was heard. And then also we heard a little bit from South County as well, and places like Irvine. Irvine, of course, is an anchor city in Orange County, and of course was one of those areas where we saw a lot of demographic growth. So across all 3 of the maps, there was a lot of back and forth about how do we keep these various communities of interest together. Irvine is both connected to Tustin and connected to Newport Beach. So which direction do we go? So it was definitely a challenge. We spent a lot of time in Southern California kind of trying things out one way and then switching them to another way and seeing what else it was possible. We use the term no stone left unturned because it was such a complex region and a region that's been changing so significantly over the last 10 years. So there was a lot of engagement from communities on the ground, and which I think is the right thing, right? It was really exciting in that way. And also thinking about it kind of in the context of Los Angeles, just to the north.
So so many, it's interesting because I'm reading the questions that are coming in, and of course they're all directed to you, Dr. Sadhwani. And I do want to note that, I mean, we've been talking about election, right? The districting of places for in preparation for elections. And so many of these interesting questions that are coming in are about what happens after the election? How effective are these politicians for the communities in question? Are they more reflective of the communities? Are there benefits to some of the changes demographically that we've seen, more responsiveness of political servants to the constituency? And can you speak to that?
Yeah, this is something I feel pretty passionate about, actually. I generally am a proponent of elected officials and candidates knocking on doors and really being in touch with the communities that they want to serve. It is a privilege to serve on behalf of the people. So truly, I think amongst the commissioners, if a member of a current sitting member of Congress was going to be displaced, that was not our concern. Legally, we could not consider it as a concern. But I think all of us had the attitude like, go meet your new neighbors, right? And putting on the political science hat, actually what I do in my day job is study elections. And so now what we're seeing is many members of Congress who have been shifted, right? If they want to continue to hold a seat in Congress, they have to get to know new people that they're going to represent. That is a function of redistricting, particularly in commission states where we're not thinking about incumbents. And so what we've seen is people like, for example, and using the example of Orange County in particular, Michelle Steele, a sitting member of Congress, she's actually now running in a district that is more Asian American than her previous district. She herself is Korean American. But she has to go get to know a whole lot of new people in that new district. Katie Porter's kind of in the same boat. She now has a more coastal district and is going to have to go and introduce herself to the people that she wants to represent and make sure that she's in touch with their needs. So my great hope is that through independent redistricting, that we will have legislators who are more responsive to communities on the ground.
Oh, I'm sorry, Kirsten.
Hi, I'm just here to pass on audience questions, but please go ahead, Carlos.
Yeah, we're already answering them. I'm reading them at the same time, and partially because they also are feeding into my thinking about responding to Dr. Sadhwani. And I feel like the second question that came in, I can answer fairly quickly, and it's the question of will this demographic change occur? Will there be a pendulum swing, and will there be a regain of population in California? I was very glib about going quickly through the reasons why people leave, and I didn't talk about why people enter California. And part of the population that is still entering California tend to be educated and higher income than the people who are leaving the state of California. So the narrative around the cost of California being prohibitive for middle income and low income households still is very strong, right? That's what's causing a lot of that movement. So people are still coming in because of the job pool. So certainly there's still that very strong reason why people would want to live in California, because California is such a powerful economy. But it's a certain kind of person who can afford California and who can take those jobs, who's qualified to take those jobs that may pose a long-term problem. California is not an island, even though some people on this side of the country where I'm living right now would like to think so. California is subjected to US immigration policy as well. And so part of the challenge with the decline in population in California is one that the whole country is facing. We have had very stringent anti-immigrant policies in this country for going on over even preceding the previous White House, the previous administration. So the aging of the population in the United States overall, and the decrease in natural household growth is causing a lot of this. And I don't see those changing anytime soon. We may have comprehensive immigration reform at the national level. I'm not holding my breath given the way things are going right now, and that's my own That is not a reflection of California Humanities' position, Endowment for Humanities' position on this. But I suspect that if California remains as unaffordable as it is, and these longer term demographic changes are going to happen or continue, we're not going to see a pendulum swing anytime soon. The last question I would throw back to Sarah, though, and if you want to read that one, Kirsten.
Yeah, thanks so much, Carlos. Sarah, it's so interesting to hear about the 40,000 pieces of testimony that the Redistricting Commission received. And so someone here is asking, how do you envision engaging the Native American population in voter registration and perhaps, also in census and redistricting efforts? And I'm wondering, did you see engagement and outreach efforts happen in 2021?
Yeah, that's such an important question, not only here in California, but in many states where there are large Native American populations. The census was, the pandemic created an interesting kind of scenario for the Redistricting Commission. Because of the delay in the census, it did slow down our work. But in slowing down our work, it actually gave us additional time to do outreach and for the commission to learn more about communities across the state, right? We all wrote essays about our understanding of communities, but we wanted to make sure that we really had a sense of where communities were and to make sure that they knew about this process. So very early on, the commissioners broke into various subcommittees to work on different aspects, and our outreach subcommittee did a phenomenal job of doing outreach, largely utilizing the network that was built through the census. So again, the state of California funds this complete count work. And that the folks who were engaged in that work, we then went back and did outreach to them to come and invite them to the commission so that they know what we're going to be doing, that they know how to be engaged, that they have the language, that we have their language too, right? It was really a reciprocal kind of relationship. So early on in the process, with those extra months that we had because of the delay in the census, we spent it educating ourselves about Native Americans. We had multiple different tribal communities come and share more information about the areas where they lived and the different kinds of considerations they had. We had numerous presentations throughout that process, and we saw what I would refer to as fairly deep engagement from some of the Native American communities, submitting maps of where tribal lands lay. Throughout the process, our mappers accessed those maps, and we would at times turn on tribal layering. So if you know anything about GIS mapping on a computer, it's multiple layers. So you could turn on like where the Latino population is, where the Asian American population is, and we had tribal lands mapped as well. And so, for example, there's a district that includes most of Riverside County, and it actually spans upward and includes this little city of Needles. Needles has a tribal reservation on it, and we wanted to keep that together with other reservation lands. And so there's a slightly odd shape to that district, but there's a reason for why that exists, right? It was trying to keep these communities together so that they could have better representation. So, in terms of voter registration, I think there's a lot of folks doing work on the ground. Certainly, I know that there's foundations that are supporting tribal interests, not only here in California, but in a host of Western states. So I would encourage, if you're in one of those spaces, to ensure that funds are going to that work. It's not something that the commission itself works on, but I think incredibly important work to do that outreach.
Thanks, Sarah. And I just want to jump in to add that California on the Ballot will be doing a program on voting and electoral engagement and civic life in the Native community. So I'll put a link to the chat if anyone would like to sign up for that. That was a great question. It looks like there's another question here, interestingly, about the coordination between different levels of government, between city, county, and state levels, and whether redistricting and census work can improve coordination or, somehow remap coordination between these three entities. So Carlos, I know you've worked in all three realms. I wonder if you have something to say, and certainly Sarah, I would love to hear your thoughts too.
Sure. It's an interesting question because one would assume, and especially in a place like California, that in the post Pete Wilson era had such a blue wave, but blue sea, I guess blue seas are blue, blue sea change occur that was reflected at multiple levels of government, right? So, so part of that is sort of the partisanship of how these various levels of government interact, are managed in terms of which party is managing those. I think that the challenge with the question is that the way our cities and our counties and our state government have been defined geographically and constitutionally don't change, right? And with a couple of exceptions, there are municipalities that choose, because of their cultural or political beliefs, create a whole new city. That's a very California phenomenon, right? That East Coasters don't understand, that people have chosen to separate themselves at some point in the last half century to full century from other parts of their jurisdictions. But the reality is that those are pretty set, those are pretty fixed. So unless to Dr. Sadhwani's analysis, the electeds in those places change and the partisan affiliations of the populations in those places change, there isn't that much effect on the coordination issue. So much of that is constitutionally defined.
Yeah. Just to add from a redistricting standpoint, I think one of the things that we saw, and I think Carlos, you're absolutely correct about that, right? I mean, at a certain level, there's certain areas of coordination and others that it's not going to happen. From the redistricting standpoint, I think one of the interesting things happening here in California is as the state, at the state level, adopted the commission model, more and more cities and counties are also adopting those models. So we saw, just a host of cities and counties, the city of Berkeley, the city of Long Beach, the city of Los Angeles even has an appointed commission, which is not independent, but various models. At the state level, we were developing a host of online tools so that people could participate in that process. Presumably, if someone wanted to tell us where their community of interest lies, it lies in the same place for the cities as it does for congressional representation or state legislative representation. So I could envision, from a redistricting standpoint, having shared tools between these different efforts. I could imagine people arguing against that as well, but I think there could be some shared resources. These tools were really fantastic, and certainly, if someone's taking the time to develop a map of where their community lies to share with the commission, they should just as easily be able to, at the click of a button, send that same submission to their local city if they wanted to do so. So I think that could certainly be an innovation for 2030, but would need coordination long in advance to have that kind of prepped and ready to go, and have that understanding prepped and ready to go, because the challenge is these commissions are only seated a few months before maps have to be drawn. So a lot of work has to happen in a short amount of time.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sarah. That's such an interesting look into the technological side of how this work happens. And to think that it happens on a 2-month timeline is really extraordinary. I just want to return to the second question that was inside of the first question we addressed, which was about evaluating the work of redistricting. Will the committee that you served on, Sarah, or any other body be looking at the outcomes of the work that's been done to redraw the lines in California?
Yeah, so we're in the process right now of doing kind of a debrief and writing a report on some of the best practices that we saw, making recommendations to the state for potential legislative changes. So one of those, for example, is prison gerrymandering. So there was a strong movement. The legislature had actually passed a law requesting that the commission take up the issue of prison gerrymandering. And this is the idea that, the census captures people who are incarcerated where they are incarcerated. But that's not the community where they lie, and it's not generally where those individuals are getting their representation from. Certainly, if they are released from prison during the next 10 years, they probably aren't going to stay in that area. They would go back to the communities where they were from. So the state had already prepared for us to take up that issue, a database of all of the people who were incarcerated at the time of the census, and identifying where, the communities where they came from, their addresses. And it was up to us to decide whether or not to put those individuals back into their communities. And of course, as a commission, we voted unanimously yes to do so. And we're actually pushing for the state to mandate that for all commissions in the future. We feel like this is very much reflective of the desires of the people of California and leads to better representation overall. And this is also a national trend that's occurring. So certainly there are some aspects of this work that we are evaluating. Myself as a researcher and as a professor, I know, as you know, my bio, you talked about in this fall, I'll actually be at Stanford University and doing an analysis outside of the commission, but more so for academic pursuits of commissions nationally, and looking at this new trend of independent commissions. A number of states adopted commissions just within the last 10 years. Places like Colorado and Michigan joined California and Arizona and Idaho and Washington. And so there's a host of states that now use this model. And so I'll be examining the outcomes of all of these independent commissions and thinking a little bit more about who are the kinds of people that serve, what are the institutional constraints and institutional designs of these different commissions. They do vary from state to state. And does that design actually lead to variations in the outcomes of the maps? Notably, the last time I had heard an update, at least, all of the states with independent commissions, and there are political commissions in some states, but independent commissions hadn't received any significant challenges to their maps. All of those maps were upheld in courts, or like in the state of California, not challenged at all. Certainly that is in stark contrast to other places like North Carolina and Florida and Texas, where we're seeing litigation after litigation on the maps that have had extreme gerrymandering occur to them by state legislators. So there's really something special happening in independent commissions, and hoping that I can capture some of that.
Great, fascinating. Well, thank you both so much. I know we're reaching the end of our time now. I just wonder if there's any last words or perhaps last resources that you'd like to point the audience to.
If folks are interested in learning more about redistricting, certainly go and check out our website, wedrawthelinescalifornia.org. All of our materials are on there. We operate in a full transparency as well. So you can even go back and watch every single meeting that we held. All of the videotapes are there, because I'm sure that's what you want to do in your spare time. But it's all there for Californians to view and see and engage with. So thank you so much for having me. This has been a really great conversation. Curtis?
And if folks are interested in demographic changes in California, I certainly encourage you to read Public Policy Institute of California's annual surveys about perceptions, as well as the demography of California and their changes. If you're interested in housing, I encourage you to, my colleagues at the Joint Center for Housing Studies would love for you to read our reports that are national and include California, but certainly the Turner Center for Housing at UC Berkeley is a wonderful resource for very California-specific housing policies and attempts to reduce costs in California that would lead to the demographic changes that lead to the political and redistricting changes that Dr. Sadhwani has mentioned.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, both of you. I'll bring those resources together and we can send them around with the video so folks on the call can tune in. But yeah, I just want to end by thanking you both so much for all your time and preparation and insight in this program. I feel so well informed now about redistricting and also about climate migration. A lot of, I think, ideas I had have been reversed and challenged and changed, and that's really what we're after here. So thank you so much. And also thanks so much to my colleagues who were behind the scenes today, Beth Segura, who took care of Zoom, Julie Fry, who helped to plan and organize this program, and to our wonderful communications team, Sheree Hill and Stephen Loskatoth, who designed the graphics and did outreach for this program. And with that, we'll say goodnight and hope to see you at an upcoming program. I think there's some links in the chat now if you'd like to sign up for our next, which will be in August on the topic of voting rights for incarcerated and formerly incarcerated Californians. Should be really interesting. So thank you again and good night.